Okay, thank you so much, Toddy, and what an honor to be here this morning to kick off our Billions to Trillions conference with our keynote conversation with the Secretary. The theme of the keynote conversation is going to be about addressing clean energy finance gaps and what we can do about it as a community to ensure that we can keep moving forward with interventions that are going to address some of the biggest challenges we see with respect to our energy profile as well as climate change. I'm Jerry Lynch. I'm the Vinik Dean of Engineering here at Duke University, and it is my honor and privilege to have a conversation with a true celebrity, Secretary Ernie Moniz. Secretary Moniz was the 13th U.S. Secretary of Energy under President Obama. He helped shape a period of extraordinary change in the American energy policy mix, advancing innovation across nuclear, fossil, and clean energy systems, strengthening the partnership between the Department of Energy and its 17 national laboratories, and grounding major policy debates in rigorous analysis, something I like to hear as an engineer. Throughout this work and his prodigious research outputs, Secretary Moniz has always put science and technology at the center of climate and energy strategy. Secretary Moniz is also an emeritus faculty member of physics and engineered systems at MIT, where he has spent the majority of his career. He also currently serves as the strategic advisor to the president of MIT, Sally Kornbluth, a much beloved Blue Devil that now resides up in Cambridge. So good Duke connection.
In the snow.
In the snow, yes. He braved the weather to get here. Today, Secretary Moniz is the founder and CEO of the EFI Foundation, allowing him to continue to bridge science, policy, and real-world implementation for true global impact. At a moment when moving from billions to trillions requires credible pathways, institutional trust, and technological realism, there are few voices better positioned to guide us in this specific conversation. So please join me in welcoming Secretary Ernie Moniz to Duke.
Thank you, Jerry.
So, Secretary, the theme of the conversation is on addressing clean energy finance gaps. Before we can address this gap, I think it would be really helpful for our conversation and for the audience to hear from your perspective, what is this gap? How do you define it? And how do you size it?
Well, I think there are really two dimensions to the gap that I would emphasize. One is kind of within the kind of traditional discussions around, how you get a capital stack together, et cetera. And I guess I would argue that in the clean energy space, we don't have a shortage of capital at the venture stage. And frankly, we don't have a shortage of capital, I would argue, at the high-end stage, the deployment stage, where very, very large amounts of capital is required. The real issue is the so-called missing middle, as it's often described, the kind of the growth equity stage, the bridge between those two ends of the spectrum. It's really hard to get, the $20 to $50 million check. $1 million is easier, and $1 billion is easier. It's kind of in the middle, and so I think that we need to think through, and many in this audience might devote themselves to thinking through how can one incentivize, for example, getting more of that capital into that middle stage, which is absolutely critical. One is seeing incremental growth there today. There have been in recent years a few funds formed specifically targeting that stage, and you're seeing more of the venture investors kind of creeping up in their check size because they're seeing that they get these companies going and they run into a wall. So I think that missing middle is a big issue. So that's one dimension. Second dimension, which really comes to the deployment end of the spectrum, is bankability. There again, I don't think there's a shortage of the capital at this stage. I'd love to reach the stage where we have a shortage of capital, because we're way far away from that right now. Right now, there aren't enough bankable projects to soak up that capital in the billions to trillions kind of transition. And I think one of the problems here, certainly in the United States, is that, and I'll focus mainly domestically, is that we don't have anything like a coherent national policy or approach in terms of this advancing this sector. We have a policy that I've termed carrots and twigs. The sticks are kind of missing, and as we know, carrots grow very unevenly season to season, which we are seeing in spades. That, of course, then translates into this whole bankability issue, because it's very hard for people to plan with the very long time horizons characteristic of the energy sector, at least of the tough tech industry, energy sector. It's very hard to plan if you don't have the kinds of certainty that I think investors look for. So it's very easy to have that capital look for other uses where some of the risk factors are much more manageable, returns are more secure, and we're left kind of holding the bag a little bit in terms of the energy sector. I'll just add one more thing, Jerry, just as an aside. This may not be directly in addressing your question, but I also think that, and when we talk about clean energy, and I think today we're going to mainly focus on that clearly, but I do think that another aspect where there's been some failure, and this does affect bankability, is that conversations around clean energy and climate, around energy security, around social equity, et cetera, are too often viewed as isolated discussions. And until we start treating them as one conversation and not multiple conversations, we're not going to make the kind of progress we want on any of those objectives. I think one is seeing a little bit of that happening now, especially on the security side, because of events like Ukraine, for example, and maybe what's happening in the Middle East. But we still aren't there. For example, I don't believe we've still integrated all of the social equity concerns. That's a broad bucket for me. It includes affordability, et cetera, workforce issues, et cetera, frontline communities. It's all in kind of a social equity bucket. But I think if you look, especially global, you look around in the United States and elsewhere, in terms of elsewhere, I'll note, for example, the yellow vest, the gilet jaune in France. President Macron in France made a very bad miscalculation in terms of what he thought was a climate policy, and it kind of was. It was also a horrible social equity policy. He's never recovered. So anyway, I think all of that has to come together in terms of addressing how we can actually support and fund projects going forward.
And I love that point about bringing the conversation to the equity piece, particularly as we're seeing a lot of pressure being put on consumers based on the expansion of the grid to address AI energy demands and things like that. It's such an important and key point here. What strategies or approaches do you think would help us increase that bankability you spoke of for clean energy deals and projects? And how do you see opportunities to bring additional investments into this sector to really drive an acceleration of these projects?
Well, I think, look, I think fundamentally, many of us, probably most people in this room, I'll certainly put myself into that category, I don't think we think often enough like investors. I mean, I think the question we should always be asking is, how would I go before the investment committee of a bank or an equity fund and get a yes? Right? And that's not so simple. I mean, I think one can categorize the kind of risks that committee would ask about. There are kind of inherently what I would call project risks. commercial risk? Is there a track record? Or am I being asked to be the first of a kind on some project? Is there a revenue risk? Will I have sufficient and stable cash flows to stay the course? Does the infrastructure exist? Or am I going to be left kind of holding the bag? You know, I'll give an example. I hate to name names, but you take, for example, Toyota's commitment to fuel cells some years back. But there was no infrastructure. Yeah. So no matter how good the car might have been or whatever the cost structure was, et cetera, the reality is you couldn't fuel them. And by the way, in contrast, something like Tesla, they said, if we're going to build the car, we got to build the infrastructure along with it. So the infrastructure risk has to be addressed. And the investment committee is going to ask, do you check not one of those boxes or two of those boxes? You got to check all three boxes. Then there's a second set of risks, which I would say comes around the policy world. Especially because we're in this world of carrots and twigs, the United States. Are those carrots going to be there? Mm-hmm. Is the policy and regulatory situation stable? Can I reasonably project whatever is the incentive is going to be there when I need it? That then comes also to the financial regulatory risk, you might say, like what's the tax structure? Is it favorable or not, et cetera. If I can't check those two boxes, the committee says no. And then I think there's another risk I would point out that is not often enough mentioned, and that's, and investment committees do, in fact, focus on reputational risk. There are some cases where a project may check the first 5 boxes, but you know, we don't really want to go there. Overall marketing, positioning of the company reputationally, et cetera. Does it raise social equity issues? It wasn't that long ago that something like carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, I would say, was not getting the check on the reputational side. There's an example, I think, of progress. You know, if you think back 10 years ago, you could not talk about carbon dioxide removal, you know, addressing legacy CO2 emissions in polite company. In the last 6, 7, 8 years, it's like, duh. We need a lot of carbon dioxide removal. We can't get to net zero. We can't get to eventual negative carbon. We will be lucky to make real progress, frankly, just working on today's emissions versus legacy emissions. So that's an example of the reputational risk. Right. I think we're making some progress there, but there are still areas. For example, suppose there were an excellent geoengineering project. I think it's going to be really hard to check that reputational box at the moment. So anyway, big things. By the way, you know, a separate issue, but kind of fits in with what we've already discussed. When you think about the kind of transformation that is often talked about in terms of getting to low carbon quickly, I mean, and that's the big deal. Yep. The issue of a secular change to lower and lower carbon is not a new story. That's a centuries-old story. But it's getting it to happen quickly is a huge issue. And going back to those various approaches like CDR, carbon dioxide removal versus mitigation of current sources, I'm all for, obviously, the mitigation of current sources, but I do want to emphasize what is not often enough focused on. Namely, that is the bucket which is the hardest one from a social disruption point of view. There are a lot of people in this country who justifiably are concerned about a rapid energy transition. in terms of their own personal situation, their family structure, their work, all kinds of things. That runs right into the teeth of mitigating and transforming today's energy system in ways that carbon dioxide removal does not.
Right.
So, I think we need to get our thinking straight on these issues.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point, also a place where policy is so direly needed, is to navigate
Yeah.
those larger societal questions.
And the reality is that, the political environment in the United States has always had its, ups and downs, shall we say. You can define what's up and what's down according to your own tastes, but whatever view you have, there have been ups and downs. For example, I did a little interesting exercise. I went back 100 years to the presidency of Calvin Coolidge. And if you look at the last 100 years of who sits in the White House, there have been a few, what I would call, NBA continuation plays, where vice presidents took over the presidency briefly, never for 2 terms. But, Truman took over when FDR died, and LBJ when JFK died, Ford when Nixon left.
Nixon is a Duke graduate, by the way. What you say?
Fuqua School, perhaps? No.
I believe law school.
The only actual, quote, normal transition was George H.W. Bush from Reagan, and he lost in his second term. So anyway, I'm going to count those continuation plays as kind of one entity. If you do that, we have alternated Republican, Democrat, et cetera, for 100 years. I didn't go back before that. If I go back before Lincoln, there was no Republican Party. But anyway, so we've regularly, let's try something new seems to be the voters' preference. But until much more recently, energy never followed that roller coaster. It was much more regional in the United States. Now, of course, we're in the situation where the energy system itself has become much more on that roller coaster. It's become much more difficult to distinguish regional variation versus political variation as they are becoming more and more the same in the country. And so this is a factor, going back to the questions around finance. Inherently, unfortunately, we seem to be baking in some political and policy and regulatory uncertainty that makes long-term capital allocation very, very difficult. And it's no coincidence that that's why more and more you see, especially in the venture space, the investments going into things like software with much faster returns, much faster implementation, et cetera. Anyway, risk management, think like an investor. Yeah. I think that's kind of what we're trying to put forward through something that we call the Energy Futures Finance Forum that we are operating out of EFI.
But I think given that point that you've raised about the change of leadership, that's a characteristic of our democracy, different parties coming and going, the coupling of that to policy and our energy policy maybe having much more variability, I would assume you're predicting an outward look of more volatility, adding more risk to the bankable projects that are there. What would be your advice to those that are looking to invest, trying to improve bankability of these deals, given the volatility that we're likely to continue to see, the changes in parties, the changes in perspectives? What is your advice to those that are trying to make decisions today going into this uncertain environment with a lot of volatility?
Well, let me start out maybe with a slightly pessimistic view and then go to an optimistic view. On the pessimistic side, it's just hard for me to see how we get out of this roller coaster for the moment. And so the question is going to end up being, how do you work within that system? And of course, the key, well, there's a big picture item which no one individual can address really, and that is that a lot of this roller coaster is because, of course, society as a whole has diminished the importance of data, of science, et cetera, because if I'm convinced that if that were in the fore, and I think all of us have a responsibility to keep at it. Sometimes it leads to a headache, but we should keep at it. But without that, I mean, I'm convinced if we had that, we wouldn't have this roller coaster in the energy space nearly as badly. We would have to worry about it in the coupling to social equity and security, et cetera. On the more optimistic side, so anyway, I think I'm actually optimistic, you know. In contrast to being an engineer, I'm a physicist, and therefore I'm inherently optimistic.
Good. Engineers are too, by the way.
I won't say what that implies for engineers, but you know, if we go back, look, we obviously know that President Trump, in his first and now in his second term, has not been favorable in terms of some of the clean energy investments. But if you go back to Trump 1.0, where there was a lot of the same rhetoric and, you know, withdrawing from Paris and all of that. I'm not arguing that Trump 2.0 and 1.0 are the same, but going back to Trump 1.0, where we have a 4-year record, I would argue, at least for the sake of debate, that you would have a hard time pointing out where the carbon trajectory changed during Trump 1.0. And that was because there are elements of stability, and I think this is part of the answer to your question. Number one, I would say, is that, of course, a lot of states and large cities in red states, you know, continue to adhere to policies that they viewed in the long term, heading to the clear secular change that is and will occur. But secondly, very importantly, the private sector. Companies then and now do not make capital allocations in the energy space on a 2 to 4 year time horizon. They didn't then, and I don't think they're doing it now. There's some change of rhetoric, but I think that the change in rhetoric is much greater than the change in investment philosophy. We still have that uncertainty, that roller coaster that's in the background, but I don't think the climate discussions are particularly changing that philosophy. The third element of stability, and those two are clearly, in my view, unchanged in reality. The third, little bit of a change, but probably less than you think. Congress has been a stabilizing influence. I know that may sound Pollyannish to many, but I would suggest just look at facts. Look at what the Congress passed this year in terms of the energy appropriations. The Congress appropriated $3.1 billion to the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, even though it no longer appears on the DOE organization chart. Congress said, that's too complicated. 3.1 billion. And clearly there were some changes. For example, I think the Congress has gone along with the administration's attempt, at least, to eliminate the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, for example, so that wasn't appropriated. But the proposed cuts, including things like wind and solar, were greatly reduced from the request, at least. Some areas like nuclear got big increases, geothermal, et cetera. So I think there actually is an element of stability there, but I would mostly emphasize states, cities, private sector, company investment horizons those have not fundamentally changed.
Which is great news to hear. I think we need that stabilizing force.
And again, the congressional stuff, those are facts. I'm not speculating. Just read the bill.
Yeah,
right.
True enough. Just in terms of reflection on your career, faculty member, went to government service, served our nation honorably as the Secretary of Energy. Now you're the CEO and founder of EFI. Can you share with us a little bit the mission of EFI and what you're trying to catalyze with EFI to continue to contribute back to this policy discussion and really affect change that'll drive a more sustainable energy future for the nation?
Well, at EFI, we're doing first, I mean, as you said earlier, we're trying to continue the approach that I think we brought into the department in terms of data-based, technically grounded analysis, because I think it's effective. Maybe it's worth, in that context, giving an anecdote. In those years when I was a secretary, we led an administration-wide 22 organizations across the administration. Initiation, unfortunately, it didn't continue, the quadrennial energy review. And I mentioned that I don't want to go into what it was in great detail. It's just that it was very, very much data-driven and technically grounded. The Congress, when I was secretary, Republicans were in control of both chambers, so split government. 21 of the recommendations of that exercise were fully or partially put into law, not in a committee, not in some, it was into law, signed out of Congress, signed by the president. I think that's the power of doing things in that way. And that's why I think we all need to keep at it and not fall into ideological traps, but stay data focused and technically grounded. So I think that's very important. Secondly, in answer to your question, from the beginning, our view has been to put forward a kind of a pragmatic approach. So it wasn't very popular when we published our somewhat provocatively named Green Real Deal back, 7, 8 years ago. And it emphasized things like coalition building. You want to move forward, you need to build a coalition. Too often, our colleagues and friends just say, no, we've got to go as fast as we want to in going to low carbon. Going as fast as we want to is very, very different from going as fast as we can. And going as fast as we can, and I would argue by definition, you can't do better than that. Yeah. And if you want to go as fast as you can, as I said earlier, you've got to have one conversation across all these areas. That we emphasized. We emphasized carbon dioxide removal. We published an RD&D recommendations back 7 years ago, something like that. It wasn't very popular then. I don't want to say I told you so, but I think a lot of frustration is building, frankly, with not making progress. Not surprising. If you want to work on your stovepipe, don't be surprised when you don't make progress. And that's another, so those two, I would say those are the two overarching trends that we want to emphasize at EFI. Great,
and I think it's greatly impactful, driving those conversations and shifting those perspectives.
And right now we're working on Green Real Deal 2.0.
I like it.
We're going to update it right now, so look for that in a couple of months.
So last question ties back to your origins as a physicist and a technologist. What do you see on the horizon, big breakthroughs that we can expect in the coming years that are really going to inflect the trajectory that we find ourselves on today?
Yeah, I think there are more breakthrough possibilities than is often recognized. I mean, because we're so much kind of in the trenches and looking at incremental approaches, and I'm not denigrating that. I mean, that's very important, continual cost reduction, et cetera. But I think there are some genuine breakthrough possibilities, and I would look at it kind of sectorally. So with electricity, which is clearly a lead horse for decarbonization, but not the only horse, but in electricity, I could name a number, but the one I would focus on, and I'm on the board of a company, so I'll confess, is fusion. I think the progress on fusion, clearly there's no fusion plant today, but the progress on fusion has been just incredible in the last 10 years. And it may not be known that there's, essentially in the United States, there's about $8 billion of private capital that has gone into privately funded fusion companies.
Wow.
So somebody's betting on this having a good chance of working. Secondly, as I said, electrons are great and I think are the lead horse, but molecules are also important. A breakthrough example on the molecule side is geological hydrogen. We have no clue whether that's a major, scalable, relatively inexpensive resource or just an idiosyncratic, drive a 25 kilowatt engine in Mali, but that's an example which could be a huge breakthrough. I mentioned carbon dioxide removal. Huge breakthrough if we can do at least one of two things, ideally both things. One is get the cost of technology approaches to CDR way, way down. Direct air capture is way too expensive today. The other thing is to make natural solutions of CDR with integrity. Right now we've got them and they're cheap, according to some, but the costs are all over the map because there's no real carbon accounting going on. A fourth area I would just mention is that things that I call platform technologies, AI, quantum systems, robotics, space technologies, you could name several others, rapidly emerging technologies and their intersections. I think in the energy space, we have barely scratched the surface of integrating those into the technology mix. I think there are huge breakthroughs possible there, particularly with regard to reliability and resilience of infrastructures, to energy efficiency, to managing complex grids with real-time decision making, all kinds of stuff where we have barely scratched the surface. So those are just four examples of what I think are real, serious breakthrough possibilities. Hopefully, if even one of them actually works, we'll be much the better off for it. If we can hit a grand slam, obviously that'd be.
Yeah, and I think with the students and the talent we have in this room, inspiring them to work on those breakthrough technologies is so critical.
And giving them a D if they fail. Right?
Absolutely.
Right, absolutely. Right.
Carrots and twigs.
Absolutely. Right.
Well, Secretary, thank you so much for this honor to have you here with us.
Thank you.